Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here to Hampshire College. Many of you are, of course, members of our community for the Eqbal Ahmad Lecture this year. I'll speak in a moment of our guest. To call her distinguished is an understatement. But let me say first a few words about the Eqbal Ahmad Memorial Lectures, which have, since their inception, been highlights for the Hampshire campus and for the entire Pioneer Valley. Though first, let me express thanks to members of our staff who've helped make this possible. Jackie Jeffrey, Flavio Risech, Michelle Tourangeau, and the entire special programs staff, media services, public safety, and the staff of the physical plant. Thanks for your excellent work. In order properly to explain the significance of the series of lectures in which this afternoon takes place, I must say a few words about Eqbal Ahmad himself. Born in South Asia before the partition of India and Pakistan in 1933 or 34, he himself was uncertain of the date. He experienced the pain of that partition and the assassination of his father as a young man. He began his education in Pakistan, taking his undergraduate degree from Foreman Christian College in Lahore. In the 1950s, he came to the United States, earning a master's degree from Occidental College and his PhD in political science from Princeton. He was a scholar and teacher, and more importantly, a man of peace who stood fearlessly for justice. He worked with Fanon in Algeria. Back in the United States in 1971, he was indicted with the Berrigans and several other pacifists on charges of conspiracy to kidnap Henry Kissinger. The court action ended in a mistrial. Over the years, Eqbal Ahmad was a fellow at both the Adlai Stevenson Institute in Chicago and the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington. He taught at the University of Chicago and at Cornell before, in 1982, finding a congenial home here at Hampshire College, where he taught as a professor of international relations and Middle Eastern studies for 15 years. He was deeply loved by his students at Hampshire and respected and admired by his colleagues here and at the 5 colleges. He had been dividing his time between Amherst and Pakistan for some years before his retirement in 1997, working to establish a university in Pakistan. He died not long thereafter in May of 1999. A prolific writer, editor, and critic, his publications appeared in the US, Pakistan, and elsewhere in the world. In June of this year, Hampshire faculty members Carolee Bengelsdorf and Margaret Surlo and Hampshire alumnus Yogesh Chandrani, published the selected writings of Eqbal Ahmad with Columbia University Press. As I'm sure all 3 editors would tell you, this was a labor of love and respect as well as a scholarly project. The book is the first single-volume collection of Eqbal's writings on international and domestic politics. It contains essays that originally appeared in Nation, the New York Review of Books, and other journals. I recommend it as an invaluable introduction to Eqbal's incisive analyses of geopolitics. And the editors have asked me to let you know that there is a party for this book at Food for Thought Books on November 15th. It's a Wednesday at 7 p.m. So information is on the green flyer, and I think it'd be a great way to celebrate the work of Hampshire faculty and alumni in preserving the memory of Eqbal's writings. Professor Butler may need no introduction, but I assure you that she will get one. Indeed, she deserves much more than I will say here, but I cannot resist the pleasure of mentioning some of her many achievements. Professor Butler's international renown is rooted, of course, in a body of published work that is characterized by learning and originality, brilliance and profundity, boldness, and deep ethical concern. Her original disciplinary home is philosophy, and her departments at Berkeley are comparative literature, rhetoric, and women's studies. In fact, none of the traditional disciplinary distinctions apply to Professor Butler, which is just one of the ways in which she and Hampshire are deeply, deeply in sympathy. Indeed, if I might use an old Christian concept, and in Latin no less, Professor Butler has an anima, a soul, that is naturaliter Hampshiriana. She's a natural Hampshire friend. I have heard tell of remarkable philosophical encounters with Spinoza that predate her college years. In fact, she attended a small liberal arts college in western New England, not far from here, Bennington, and was no stranger to the Northampton, Amherst area during those years, nor, if I remember correctly, during her time at Yale University, where she took her graduate degrees in philosophy. After teaching briefly at Wesleyan University and George Washington University, she became associate professor and then professor of humanities at Johns Hopkins. She came to the University of California, Berkeley in 1993, where, since 1998, she's been the holder of the Maxine Elliott Chair. Professor Butler's first book focused on the reception of Hegel by French intellectuals and philosophers of the 20th century. It was her second book, Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, appearing in 1990, which catapulted her to the place she occupies as the most important and influential theorist of feminism and gay and lesbian studies through the 90s and into the new millennium. It would be impertinent of me to offer a précis of Gender Trouble, one of the most widely cited, discussed, and translated works, now into some 20 languages. But at the risk of reduction, what made the book revolutionary was the application of the insights of speech act theory to gender and identity. 3 years later, Professor Butler expanded her analysis of both gender and identity as performative acts in her third book, Bodies That Matter, on the discursive limits of sex. I cannot omit an anecdote here that may bore her, for she has heard it before, but once I was asked by the University of California to fill out a form meant to be sent to the bureaucrats in Sacramento. Its intent was to convince California legislators of the value of the university. We were asked to list inventions of our faculty. Meant were no doubt discoveries that were highly profitable, but my list was simple. Professor Butler had discovered the performativity of gender. I enjoyed imagining the discussion that then ensued on the floor of the State House. Girly men, as Governor Schwarzenegger once said. Indeed. The status of the body and personal identity are, of course, philosophical themes with long histories, and Professor Butler brings the entire philosophical tradition to bear on issues that are of pressing concern to thinking individuals today. The political aspects of her work, implicit in her second and third books, come yet more explicitly to the form in Excitable Speech, A Politics of the Performative, and The Psychic Life of Power, Theories in Subjectivity. One doesn't know where to stop, and just let me quickly review some of the titles that followed that, involving, as they do, investigations into law and language, culture, and kinship. For example, Antigone's Claim, Kinship Between Life and Death. Among more recent titles is both Undoing Gender and the long-awaited Judith Butler Reader. Professor Butler reflects on the painful intersection of human responsibility and the larger political canvas in giving an account of oneself, a critique of ethical violence, and precarious life, the powers of mourning and violence. I find of signal interest the degree to which her work has been taken up not only in the traditional centers of scholarship in Western Europe, in Italy, in Paris, Berlin, and Munich, but also in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. She has dedicated time to work with scholars and political figures throughout these areas, and she has also traveled to Palestine, the topic of her talk today. I will not, indeed, could not anticipate her remarks, but I do recall that she was one of the few who challenged Harvard's former president, Larry Summers, in print when he had dangerously equated criticism of certain policies of the contemporary Israeli government with anti-Semitism. Professor Butler is a caring force, not just for peoples, but for individuals. As you can imagine, she has more advisees than you can imagine. At one point, I counted 20 PhD dissertations being written directly under supervision. And despite the number, though, she does not stint on the attention she lavishes on each student. As for tireless, I have to tell you what would often take place during those years when I was a dean at Berkeley and she was at the time chair of rhetoric. a department at Berkeley that is something like the dream graduate school version of Hampshire College. Part of that time, she was also at the same time chairing women's studies. Here's the scary part. Quite frequently, after phone or email consultations that might end at 11:30 or 11 p.m., I would log on the next morning at 6 or 7 and find an extensive, even exhaustive document that she had drafted overnight and shipped to me around 4:30 or 5. Eqbal Ahmad's friend, Howard Zinn, said of Eqbal, "Ahmad's world outlook transcends nationalist pride, expressing a profound passion for the equal right to dignity of humans in every corner of the globe. His knowledge of world affairs was formidable, coming in part from his personal acquaintance with important political actors on several continents. He was not an armchair analyst, but a participant in some of the important struggles of our time in Algeria, in Vietnam, in Palestine. He was never bound by a single ideology, always committed to social justice. In short, an exemplary human being." Judith Butler honors these same values in her work and in her engagement in the world. It is an honor for me to welcome her to join the roster of distinguished scholars and speakers who have delivered Eqbal Ahmad lectures to date. General Kofi Annan of the UN, scholar Edward Said, author Arundhati Roy, professors Fatemeh Mernissi and Mahmoud Mamdani, Dr. Mustafa Barghouti, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, and linguist Noam Chomsky. The title of Professor Butler's lecture is Universality and Its Paradoxes, Hidden Histories of Post-Zionism. Welcome, Professor Butler.
Well, I'm enormously pleased to be here and very honored to be speaking for this lecture series and also to be so generously introduced by my friend and former colleague, Ralph Hexter. It is, of course, an enormous loss to the University of California that he has left us. It's an enormous gain both for him and for you that he has arrived here. I'm very jealous, but I'm trying in a daily way to be generous. I'm particularly honored to be speaking at this lecture series, and I hope that it will prove to be true that my own values and my own thinking about the politics of the Middle East will come close to Eqbal Ahmad's, and that you will see the kinship in our views as I go along. Although it's commonly said that a one-state solution and an ideal of binationalism are impracticable goals, even by those who bear such concepts goodwill, it is doubtless equally true that a world in which no one held out for a one-state solution and no one thought any more about binationalism would be a radically impoverished world. I take it that we might say the same about pacifism. It might be discredited as lacking all realpolitik, but would any of us want to live in a world in which pacifists no longer existed? What kind of world would that be? It came as a surprise and also a gift to me to read one of Edward Said's last books, Freud and the Non-European, not only because of the lively re-engagement with the figure of Moses, but because Moses becomes for him in that text an opportunity to articulate two theses that are, in my view, worth considering. The first is that Moses, an Egyptian, is the founder of the Jewish people, which means that Judaism is not possible without this foreigner, and indeed this Arab. This founding implies a diasporic origin for Judaism, which suggests that a fundamental status is accorded the condition by which the Jew is wrought by the non-Jew, defined in relation to the non-Jew, and has this inevitable task of cohabitation with the non-Jew as its original meaning. Of course, there are reasons to be suspicious of origins, but Said leads us back to this one to incite the recognition of an alternative history to the Jewish people, one that points out both its pre-Zionism and its post-Zionism, perhaps even its early Zionism, if we consider Buber's insistence on cohabitation in his famous Land of Two Peoples. The second dimension of Said's text effectively follows from the first, since his text is something of a petition, an incitation, an invitation to consider that displacement characterizes the histories of both the Palestinian and Jewish peoples, and so, in his view, constitutes the basis of a possible, even desirable alliance and commonality between them. Now, in this late work of Said's, we do not find much in the way of realpolitik. Indeed, his mode of address is aspirational. It may be that binationalism is an impossibility, as I've suggested, but that mere fact does not suffice as a reason to be against it. At the same time, binationalism is not just an ideal to come, something we might hope to arrive in a more ideal future, but the name for an alliance to be found in the daily practices of living together, thus resonating with the meaning of ta'ayush. In his view, Jews and Palestinians are cousins of a sort, both of them Semites, as he's eager to remind us, and so historically considered bound together from the start. Moses is the figure of their cathexis, a living conjuncture. And if we consider that Moses was a non-European, this means that the non-European Jew as well, the Arab Jew, is at the origin of our understanding of Judaism as well. This fact has contemporary implications not only for rethinking the history of the Jewish people in ways that do not presume a European origin, and hence including the Mizrahim and the Sephardim as central to its history, but also for understanding that the Arab Jew constitutes conjuncture, chiasm, and cohabitation as a founding principle of Jewish life. Said thus notes that the non-European from the Ashkenazi Jewish point of view is essential to the meaning of Judaism. In this way, Said himself acts as the non-European who might found the Jewish people again. And though this might read as hubris, to borrow a term from the Greeks, it strikes me as a moving invocation. I mean, why shouldn't they be in here too? It strikes me as a moving invocation to recall an originary and insuperable alliance. Although Said was never a devotee of post-structuralism, hardly, and its critique of the subject, which he cautioned against in his critique of Foucault, it's clear that what he likes most in Freud's embrace of Moses as the non-European, the Egyptian, as the founder of the Jews, is the challenge that the figure of Moses poses to a strictly identitarian politics. If Moses is to stand for a contemporary political aspiration, it would be one that refuses to be organized exclusively on principles of national, religious, or ethnic identity. It would be one that accepts a certain impurity and mixedness as the conditions of contemporary social and political life. Further, for Said, Freud boldly exemplifies the insight that even for the most definable, the most identifiable, the most stubborn communal identity, and for Freud this was Jewish identity, there are inherent limits that prevent it from being fully incorporated into a monolithic and unified identity, singular and exclusive. Said writes, identity, in other words, identity cannot be thought or worked through itself alone. It cannot constitute or even imagine itself without that radical, originary break or flaw, which will not be repressed because Moses was Egyptian and therefore always outside the identity inside which so many have stood and suffered and later perhaps triumphed. Remarkable here is that although Said reflects on the origins of Judaism, he finds there at the site of that origin an impurity, a mixing with otherness, what continental philosophers might call an ineradicable alterity, which turns out to be constitutive of what it is to be a Jew. The strength of this thought, he tells us, is that it can be articulated in and speak to other besieged identities as well as a troubling, disabling, destabilizing, secular wound, end quote. He asks whether we might continue to think this thought of two peoples, diasporic, living together, where the diasporic, understood as a way of attaining identity only with and through the other, becomes the basis for a certain binationalism. Can this thought aspire to the conditions of a politics of diasporic life? He asks, can it ever become the not-so-precarious foundation in the land of Jews and Palestinians of a binational state in which Israel and Palestine are parts rather than antagonists of each other's history and underlying reality? I would like to query further, is it precisely through a politics that affirms the irresolution of identity that binationalism becomes thinkable? Now, in a longer project, I hope to return to the question of post-Zionism as a contemporary intellectual and political phenomenon, but which I want to argue has a history that is not only archaic in the sense that Moses exemplifies, but which has been formulated in a number of generally unacknowledged ways throughout the 20th century history of Judaism. I think one can find historical traces of post-Zionism prior to Zionism, or indeed as part of early versions of Zionism, as I've suggested above. Oddly, the classical liberal position is generally considered post-Zionist, even as post-Zionism takes all sorts of other forms as well. When an Israeli such as Ilan Papa from the University of Haifa publicly remarks that he would like to live in a secular state, one that does not discriminate on the basis of religion, ethnicity, or race, it is common to hear that his position aids and abets, and I quote, the destruction of the Jewish state. Now, if a Palestinian, Israeli Palestinian or not, espouses the same position, namely that citizenship ought not to be determined by religious or ethnic membership, then that is close to a terrorist act. It's quite interesting to wonder how it became historically possible for the precepts of classical liberalism to be equated with terrorism in the beginning of the 21st century. How are we to understand this charge of destruction, the destruction of the Jewish state, the Israeli state? The destruction of the Israeli state is one thing, the destruction of the Jewish state is even more alarming, right? We hear it, I think, quite often. The word destruction resonates with that other phrase, the destruction of the Jewish people, which was, after all, the stated aim and near accomplishment of Hitler's genocide. When we hear the word destruction again in contemporary political discourse, as the woeful and predicted consequence following from post-Zionist views, the resonances of the term are mobilized against those who espouse it. We are asked to think of massive violence, the reiteration of ineffable catastrophe, and so with the most unconscionable collaboration with Hitlerian politics. Indeed, as soon as that association is secured, and I would suggest it is secured for most in a flash, then the conversation comes to an end, and the viewpoint that is being espoused is, oddly enough, excluded from the domain of acceptable public speech. If what post-Zionism calls for is the establishment of a new polity based on principles elaborated in classical liberalism to begin with, that is, with religion firmly separated from any conditions of citizenship, formal and substantive, and if one need go no further than Locke or Montesquieu to make such claims, then it would seem that classical liberalism is precisely what threatens the state of Israel. Thus, when we are talking about the destruction of that state as a consequence of holding to the view that religion and conditions of citizenship ought best to be separated, we are engaging in nothing more than an open debate on whether non-exclusionary criteria for rights of citizenship can be developed and implemented for that region. Indeed, one might hold to these views and be rigorously pacifist. One might hold to these views and believe that such a transition to a new polity should happen through the elaboration of new law. But in either case, the charge of violence or destruction is levied through the use of the term destruction, as in these views lead to the destruction of the Jewish state, which of course holds within it that traumatic resonance, the destruction of the Jew, right? Destruction of the Jewish state, destruction of the Jewish people, the destruction of the Jew. If we were to take this line, analyzing it carefully, we might see that the charge, these views lead to the destruction of the Jewish state, illicitly draws upon the claim that these views lead to the destruction of the Jewish people, or more elliptically, the Jews, and so these views are inseparable from fascist views or from Nazi views. But it's clearly one thing to ask about the conditions under which Jews might live peaceably, productively, and equitably with non-Jews, and to think of forms of government that might require a transition from the current regime to another in order to realize those goals. And quite another thing to call for the violent destruction of a state or even to be in favor of violence against its population. Indeed, the former set of claims, imagining the transition to a new polity through legal or pacifist means, may well be a way of envisaging a way out of violence altogether. Indeed, it could be part of a politics of nonviolence or anti-violence. The public enunciation of such views, what I'm calling post-Zionist views, I believe are calling for or are based upon the proposition that formal acts be undertaken by which equality might be more radically achieved and contemporary forms of discrimination, differential violence, and harassment against the Palestinian people brought to an end. They call for a new concept of the citizen, a new constitutional basis for the country, and a radical reorganization of land partitions, illegal property allocations, and even minimally, a concept of multiculturalism that extends to Jewish, Arab, and Christian inhabitants of these lands. Now, one might argue against all these propositions as unreasonable, but even then we would have to ask whether the refusal to extend equality, the refusal to extend protection against violence, the refusal to participate in the just redistribution of lands is itself based on tacit or explicit desires for Jewish demographic advantage and a politics that would maintain cultural and religious purity for the region. It seems to me that it is at this point that the affective stakes of nationalism circumscribe in a violent way the domain of acceptable political speech, precisely when the post-Zionist view is considered outside the pale or not acceptable within public discourse. Similarly, I think that there's a confusion that happens when the question is posed to Palestinians, and indeed it's posed all the time. Do you accept Israel's right to exist? It's often taken to be synonymous with, are you in favor of the destruction of Israel, where Israel is understood as Israeli property, lives, institutions, and territorial integrity. The question pertaining to the right to exist is of another order, though, since the question asks whether the territorial claims and state apparatus have been founded upon legitimate grounds. One might, for instance, argue that the founding of Israel was in no sense legitimate, but that in contemporary life, practical politics requires that the state of Israel be negotiated with, and in that sense recognized, and that a mode of cooperation be found with which to deal with that particular country. One might argue, well, the founding of Israel was illegitimate, but there are concrete ways that Israel can and should offer restitution for stolen lands and displaced populations since 1948. In other words, it doesn't follow that disputing the legitimacy of Israel's founding and its continuing claims to certain lands, claims that are, of course, augmenting themselves as we speak, implies that one is in favor of the violent destruction of the current state of Israel. Rather, it only implies that certain long-standing issues of legal injustice and political violence are in need of redress, and that a legitimate basis for a state formation is what is called for in that region. This last position is a political point of view, but it's not the same as a gun or artillery directed against Haifa or Tel Aviv. Indeed, by engaging the questionable legitimacy of the Israeli state and its polities, there's no reason to think that such differences could be adjudicated within the sphere of political negotiation. But when the questioning of legitimacy is regarded as a declaration of war, then that question cannot be admitted into the sphere of politics. It cannot even be asked as an historical question. It cannot even be asked as a legitimate kind of question for an historian of the region to pose. And so war becomes presumed as the mode of expression for that perspective. In other words, if I call into question what happened in 1948, I am declaring war on the state. I don't think that that follows. Now, I think Hannah Arendt, who was hardly a terrorist, she was hardly brandishing weapons when she argued in the late 40s and early 50s against Israel as a state based on notions of Jewish sovereignty. Indeed, Arendt would now be considered a post-Zionist. She was never a Zionist. But we might think of Arendt as the trace of post-Zionism that exists prior to its historical inception. Arendt was perhaps in the 20th century the most avid secular Jewish critic of Zionism, and she was able to articulate reasons why she found the establishment of the state of Israel to be illegitimate without thereby calling for a war against that polity. She insisted early on that Israel ought not to be restrictively Jewish, and she thought its efforts to legitimate its claims to the land through state violence could only lead to racist forms of colonization and permanent conflict. She also objected to the role the so-called superpowers played in the crafting of the 48 solution. Since she saw no polity, she believed that no polity could be founded and sustained without a popular democratic exercise of freedom. 1948, as a solution imposed upon a community in part by powers who were not inhabitants of the land, was, in her view, the exact opposite of the democratic revolutions she outlined in On Revolution, in which a collective works through concerted action to found a legal order for itself. So Arendt was no Zionist, and her criticisms were in part a direct implication of her critique of colonialism. By the way, she was no brilliant critic of colonialism, but here she managed to articulate one. Buber, Martin Buber, on the other hand, was a cultural Zionist, and he was clearly no secularist. He was an advocate of cooperative ventures, and certainly not a realist when it came to the implementation of his vision. His version of Zionism has now become so anathema that it can only be read as post-Zionism at this point in time. His political position was rather resolutely defeated by the establishment of Israel as a Jewish state in 1948, an act which he understood to be a definite undermining of Zionism. He even said it was a perversion of Zionism. He and others in the Ehud organization disputed the legitimacy of Ben-Gurion's 1948 Declaration of Political Sovereignty, and he called for binationalism and for a federated state, but his views quickly became unpopular. Although Buber called for a federated state and was a defender of binationalism, he didn't seem to understand that the project of settler colonialism, with its seizure of lands and subjugation of Palestinian laborers, undermined the possibility of realizing his cooperative ideals. Although in his early work he argued for a spiritual Zionism that would stay away from claims of land and national statehood, he came to realize the practice of working with the land, importing a neo-Lockean rationale for land appropriation. Indeed, he understood the settlement of the lands to be a realization of Zionism, even as he resisted the claim to political sovereignty for the Jewish people. He imagined cooperative agricultural efforts as the basis for any future polity. Painfully, though, he described in neutral terms the Jewish settlements as colonization, and even accepted that colonization had its virtues. He sought, paradoxically, humane forms of colonization, arguing for what he called concentrative colonialism rather than expansionist colonialism. Now, the use of the word concentrative in the early 40s must have carried some terrifying resonances, given its association with the German Konzentrationslager. But it became all the more worrisome when we see the success of concentrative colonialism in the West Bank, and most emphatically today in Gaza, that open-air prison where living conditions are so cramped and impoverished that UN organizations are now suggesting that we have a situation of starvation on our hands. Now, Buber was clearly not prepared to undertake a critique of colonialism, but he did hold out for a federated state. I'm not quite sure how he was going to put these things together, where Jewish and Palestinian cultural autonomy could be maintained, and where the majority, most emphatically, the majority would never be in a position to tyrannize the minority. He called for the return of Arab land seized in 1948 and illegally redistributed in the early 1950s. And he asked the Israeli public to try and understand why there might be Palestinian rage against Jews, chastising Israelis for having violated Arab trust and not undertaken cooperative self-government, the fair distribution of arable land, a just adjudication of property rights, and recognition of the humanity of its neighbors. Buber imagined that modes of civil and economic cooperation would lead organically to a form of government that would be based on a shared way of life between Arabs and Jews. He called for the process of peace and cooperation to begin at the cultural level with the organization of life itself, with the task of what he called living together, and thought that a state form should not be imposed. Rather, in his view, an internally complex federal form of government for the region would and could emerge from this common life wrought together. Now, if we return to Said's formulation, we can see that the figure of Moses offers a slightly different conception of cohabitation than we see in Buber's notion of cooperation. The figure of Moses brings together in his person disparate traditions, Jewish and non-Jewish. If the Jew is bound to the non-Jew as a condition of Jewish life, then the Jew and the non-Jew are not exactly separable. The Jew, at least, cannot be thought without the non-Jew. To be a Jew means living in relation to the non-Jew, finding a way to refuse identitarian closure. In this way, Said is perhaps closer to the ethical position of Emmanuel Levinas than to Martin Buber. After all, for Levinas, the subject, the human subject, is constituted by what he calls the other. And though Levinas sometimes means the other as this other before me, this one person, or this group of people, he also means the infinite other, a notion of the divine, and interestingly enough, we only understand that infinite other through the concrete others whom we know. For Buber, of course, the concrete others are the mediated way in which the presence of God is made known to us. For Levinas, it is through the face of the other that some indirect understanding of the infinite ethical demand, that is the divine demand, is communicated to us. The other person, we might say, is over there. The other person is not me. The other person is an alterity, an otherness, in a clearly locatable sense. But at the same time, and these thoughts have to be thought together, that other also constitutes me. I am from within riven by this ethical demand that is at once and indissolubly over there, coming from over there, the face of the other, and in here as the constitutive condition of myself. This position differs from the I thou that we find in Buber. In Buber, what we find is a relation that insists upon separate identities, culturally distinct, autonomous, that nevertheless federate as a cooperative dialogue and venture. So I am here, the other's over there, and we enter into dialogue in order to know one another. For Levinas, I am not an I without the other. The I that I am is interrupted by the other. I am not a human subject without being beholden to the other, and so that obligation to the other constitutes me fundamentally and even interrupts me, or it is that by which I am riven. Indeed, the Levinasian position assumes a certain asymmetry of the relationship between the subject and its other. It also assumes that this other is already me, not exactly assimilated as a part of me, but inassimilable as that which interrupts my own continuity and makes impossible a fully autonomous self at some distance from an autonomous other. Indeed, autonomy becomes something of a lie. And we might think that in order to have an ethical project, we must first be autonomous. For Levinas, it is the opposite. In order to be ethically bound to another, we have to discover the limits of our own autonomy. Indeed, the Levinasian position would defeat Buber's philosophical notion of dialogue, despite the superficial resonances between them. And I want to suggest that the interruption by the other, the way in which the ontology of the self is constituted on the basis of this eruption of the other at the heart of myself, implies a critique of the autonomous subject, as well as a critique of certain versions of multiculturalism that assume that cultures are internally constituted as homogeneous entities, and that those cultures need only establish a dialogue between them in order to understand one another. In Levinas's view, there is a heterogeneity that is prior to my being, and which constantly makes for a decentering of this autonomous subject that I appear to be. It also permanently complicates the question of location. Where do I begin and end? And what are the locatable parameters of the other? This position maintains some alliances, I would say closer alliances to Said, as he considers Moses, than to Buber, oddly enough. The politics of miscegenation implied by Said's use of Moses would seem to constitute the more radical alternative. All right, so that's the philosophically hardest part of my talk. It wasn't so bad. You survived. You're still here. It's okay. Indeed, I expected at first to be able to derive the strongest statement within Jewish thought of the ethical obligation to the other from Levinas. That was my expectation when I first started this project. It seemed to me that such an obligation would not be contingent, but it would follow from the constitution of the subject by and in what I'm calling alterity or otherness. Of course, to make use of Levinas for a left politics is a problem. Indeed, one has to read him against his own Zionism, and one has to read him against his emphatic and unequivocal refusal to engage Palestinians as the other who makes who make an ethical demand upon me. In fact, when he was asked in an interview whether the Palestinians have a face, he said no. Okay. How, it seemed at that moment he deratifies everything he's ever said. Okay, so one has a choice. One ceases to read him, one throws him out, one sells one's books, one does something. Or one goes back to the position and says, okay, what would have happened had he had a different politics, and what can we do with him, even though he himself would not have done it and he would not have condoned that which we will now do to him. Philosophically, Levinas outlines an ethical scene in which we're obligated, under most situations, to preserve the life of the other, obligated by the alterity that we encounter there, one that makes an infinite demand upon us. Upon closer inspection, it turns out that this scene of obligation, a scene that's supposed to obligate us universally, is restricted culturally and geographically. The ethical obligation toward the face of the other is not one that one can or does feel toward every face. If this is true, then the ethical demand is not prior to notions of cultural autonomy, but is precisely framed and restricted in advance by certain notions of culture, ethnicity, and religion. This has concrete implications for understanding the commandment, thou shalt not kill. For Levinas, the prohibition against violence is restricted to those whose face makes a demand upon me, and yet these faces are differentiated by virtue of their religious and cultural background, which then open up the question of whether there is any obligation to preserve the life of those who do not appear, or rather who appear faceless within his view, or perhaps most appropriately, do not appear at all. We've not yet seen the study of the faceless in Levinas, but let's presume it's on its way. The fact that Palestinians remain faceless for him, or that they are the paradigm for the faceless, produces a rather stark quandary, since Levinas gives us so many reasons to extrapolate politically on the prohibition against killing. For Levinas, the messianic tradition is explicitly one that seeks to counter the politics of revenge, and a reader might reasonably conclude that this would lead him to a non-nationalist politics and a course of minimal violence. When he opposes revenge, he argues that there's no justice to be had in killing those who have killed those who are closest to oneself, and that there's no justice to be had in killing those by whom one fears becoming killed oneself. These views, however, seem to reach their limit. In his book, Difficult Freedom, it's clear that Levinas refers to the messianic sensibility of a particular collective, the Jews, who in his view have experienced the arbitrary violence of historical events. And though we've been told that this ethical perspective traverses historical time, Levinas appears to forget his precept and moves quite quickly into a discussion of Israel as an historical place, people, and state. Indeed, he goes on to claim that the fate of the Jews is to act within the terms of a universalist particularism. This is no arbitrary fate, but a necessary one. And though in his view historical events have an arbitrariness to them, the Jewish task, its fate in his terms, is to reconcile the particular with the universal. On the one hand, this task is fate and does not take place in history. It is an elect and singular task or destiny, a recurrent one that remains indifferent to particular historical events. On the other hand, this ahistorical fate grounds his argument in favor of Zionism as an historical and contemporary reality. If this fate is necessary and ahistorical, then it's not the same as history, understood as an arbitrary sequence and field of accidentality, which is distinct, in his view, from the domain of judgment and morality. The problem, of course, is that on the one hand, Levinas wants to say that the obligation to the face, to anyone's face, is a universal one, that it applies not just to this face or that face, but to any face. On the other hand, he wants to say there are certain faces that are not faces, or certain kinds of humans do not have a face, or certain people who are emerging from particular political polities do not have a face. He also wants to say that the messianic task of Judaism is to elaborate a universal set of principles, and as universal, they would be applicable to all people. On the other hand, he wants to say that this task is a task of Judaism because Judaism has suffered historically in some way, that the Jews have suffered historically in some way that no other people have suffered. Now, one could not particularly like this paradox or find that it that it puts him in a contradictory position, but it becomes, I think, quite problematic when he ends up defining the Jews as those who have only suffered persecution and never persecuted. And in fact, he wants to claim, and he says it quite explicitly, that the meaning that the Holocaust has for his reflections on persecution and responsibility suggest that the Jews, not just in that historical example, but throughout history, are subjects of persecution, and that their universal ethics can be derived from their status of persecution. He's surely aware that to derive responsibility from having been persecuted echoes perilously with those who would have blamed the Jews and other victims of the Nazi genocide for their own fates. And he rejects this view. But he does establish persecution as a certain kind of ethical opportunity, or at least a dimension of ethics that cannot be superseded. He situates the particular nexus of persecution and responsibility at the core of Judaism, even the essence of Israel. And in what follows, the quotation that follows, it's important to note that by Israel, he refers ambiguously and consequentially to two senses of the word: Israel, the Jewish people, and Israel, the land of Palestine. What is the land of Palestine? So here's the quotation. The ultimate essence of Israel derives from its innate predisposition to involuntary sacrifice, its exposure to persecution. Not that we need think of the mystical expiation that it would fulfill like a host. To be persecuted, to be guilty without having committed any crime, is not an original sin, but the obverse of a universal responsibility, a responsibility for the other that is more ancient than any sin. It is an invisible universality. It is the reverse of a choosing that puts forward the self before it is even free to accept being chosen. It is for the others to see if they wish to take advantage of it. It is for the free self to fix the limits of this responsibility or to claim entire responsibility. But it can do so only in the name of that original responsibility, in the name of this Judaism. Now, this is a complex paragraph for many reasons, but one of the things it does is it draws a link between the suffering of the Jews under Nazism and the suffering of Israel, understood both as land as people from 1948 to 1971, which is the date of the writing of that particular essay. The fate of Israel is equated with the fate of the Jews itself, which is a pretty wild conflation, but that's already controversial since it dismisses from the start diasporic and non-Zionist traditions in Judaism. More emphatically, though, it's clearly wrong to claim that the state of Israel only suffered persecution or can only be conceptualized as suffering persecution during 48 to 71, given the massive and forcible displacement of more than 700,000 Palestinians from their homes and villages in 1948 alone, not to mention the continuing war occupation and the extrajudicial killings that have claimed the lives of thousands of Palestinians in the ensuing years. It's curious that Levinas would here extract persecution from its concrete historical occurrence, something that the Jews suffered in World War II under the regime of Hitler, clearly true, establishing it now as an apparently timeless and recurring essence of Judaism itself. After all, he's made reference to the Nazi campaign to exterminate the Jews of Europe as an historical event. If persecution now characterizes the fate of the Jews and constitutes a recurrent and ahistorical dimension of existence, then any historical argument suggesting that Jews are not always in the situation of being persecuted would have to be refuted on definitional grounds alone. To say, oh, the Jews are not just persecuted but also persecuting, or there might be a gray zone, or in certain wars responsibility is mixed. If one tried to speak this way, it would be to misunderstand the definition of the Jews. It would be to misidentify or to misapprehend Judaism itself. Jews cannot be persecutory since by definition Jews are the persecuted. Now, this attribution of a central and recurrent persecution to Israel, defined ambiguously as people and place, seems corroborated by his view of the idea that something about Judaism is not, strictly speaking, historical. that it transcends history, and that persecution is not, strictly speaking, an historical relation. Jews, according to him, are considered elect because they carry a message of universality. But what is universal in Levinas's view would be bound to this specific historical situation of being persecuted, one that is consistently disavowed as historical. Indeed, the Jew, in his view, is no longer an historical phenomenon. We can't say that there's a group of people who came into being called the Jews and they have a particular history and culture. To be a Jew is already to be outside of history and yet to find one's fate as persecuted, recurrent through history. Now, I want to say that the same confusion between what's historical and what's not historical is made clear in another context where, with blatant racism, Levinas claims that Judaism and Christianity are the cultural and religious preconditions of ethical relationality itself, at which point we realize that nobody would be able to think the category of universality if they were not formed within a Jewish or Christian or Judeo-Christian tradition. For instance, he warns against the rise of the countless masses of underdeveloped peoples of Asiatic descent who threaten the newfound authenticity of Jewish universalism. He claims that ethics can never be based on exotic cultures. He claims that one may not denounce the hunger of others, but then he says, quite clearly, under the greedy eyes of those countless hordes who wish to hope and live, we, the Jews and Christians, are pushed to the margins of history, and soon no one will bother anymore to differentiate between a Catholic and a Protestant, or a Jew and a Christian. So he's worried. He's being edged off the stage of history. Even Marxism, he says, whose universalism might once have binded these religions in a new unity, will be lost in the vastness of these foreign civilizations and impenetrable pasts, end quote. He calls for a new kinship between Christians and Jews to combat this rise in what can only be called, in his terms, barbarism. And in fact, there's a great story that Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist, tells me about attending a conference at the Vatican around 20 years ago, where Levinas was there and Charles Taylor was there, and a number of people were there to talk about interreligious dialogue. And the Pope, John Paul at that time, was claiming that there must be a robust interreligious dialogue between Muslims, Christians, and Jews, forgetting that there are a whole lot of other religions as well. But we're at least, getting a little bit out of that kind of bind, not very far, but some measure. And Levinas said, no, ce n'est pas possible. And he said that there was a fraternity, a fraternity between the Jews and the Christians that demanded the exclusion of the Muslim because the Jew and the Christian were derived from Abraham. And the Pope very gently said, no, I'm not going in that direction. And Levinas was apparently very upset. Anyway, so he's no pal. He's no ultimate political pal, this Levinas that I'm reading. But I want to suggest that one can nevertheless read him in order to see something of how it is that a certain kind of ethical point of view, which can claim to be universal but also culturally parochial and even racist, can understand itself and, as justified and produce and reproduce a self-justifying rationale. To argue that any historically constituted group of people are by definition always persecuted and never persecutory seems not only to confound what is historical about those people, what is essential about those people, but to license an unacceptable irresponsibility and a limitless recourse to aggression in the name of self-defense, one that I think we've seen quite clearly in recent days. The Jews, of course, have a culturally complex history that includes the sufferings of anti-Semitism, pogroms, and concentration camps, but there's also a history of religious and cultural traditions that exist, many of which are pre-Zionist, and there's a history more vexed than is usually acknowledged of a relation to Israel as a complex ideal and political issue. To say that persecution is the essence of Judaism not only overrides agency and aggression performed in the name of Judaism, but preempts a cultural and historical analysis that would have to be complex and specific through recourse to a singular pre-ontological condition, one that, understood as universal, is identified as the transhistorical and defining truth of the Jewish people. So with Levinas, we could say, what happened to the face? It was such a good idea. What happened to the commandment to stay attuned to the precarious life of the other, its demand that I become dispossessed in a relationality that always puts the other first? Suddenly, there's a figure not of a face, but of a faceless horde. And whoever these hordes are, they threaten not only to engulf this me, but a collective we who has, contrary to the understanding of Messianism, found itself in the historical position of carrying alone, or with its Christian kin, the spirit of universality itself. You'll note there's no nameable Islam here, and there's no nameable Arab here, only something vaguely Asiatic, without a face, threatening engulfment, but also threatening the people whose elected task it is to carry universality, and so, oddly enough, threatening universality itself. There can be no commandment that issues from the face of this other faceless, is not one to whom I have a responsibility. Rather, this other, faceless, threatens to undermine the entire tradition from which the face emerges, the entire legacy of the commandment itself, right? So that other becomes a threat to universality and to culture and to ethical relationality. Here, I think we can see the Ashkenazi presumption that underwrites the Levinasian ethical scene. We read as well a frank argument in favor of Jewish majority rule. His fear of engulfment is precisely the fear that we hear voiced by some Israelis who fear that what power sharing or cohabitation might imply. And any sense of Zionism as a philosophy of cohabitation is surely lost from view. Levinas freely refers to the exceptional fate of Judaism, objects to Islam as a founded religion, something I find quite astonishing, as if Judaism is not founded. It came from elsewhere, but not founded, meaning it was, if Islam is founded, it's charismatically induced by a leader who worked his way with unthinking peoples. But I guess we don't describe Moses that way. Levinas can only make this claim about the deficiency of Islam by forgetting, in fact, that Judaism is founded by Moses, an Egyptian. And I want to say that this repression of Moses in Levinas's Judaism is quite consequential, and it leads us back to Said. It's important to turn, I think, not only to Freud, who remembered that Moses was at the origin, but to Said, who remembers that if Judaism is to mean anything, it will be by virtue of its founding implication in what is not Jewish. Those so-called hungry hordes whom Levinas fears, who threaten to rise up and destroy the Judeo-Christian foundation of his idea of civilization, are in Said's view precisely those people in need, the dispossessed, and the refugees with whom diasporic Judaism maintains an ethical solidarity. Paradoxically, it is Said who becomes at such a moment the non-European founder of Judaism, or at least the one who petitions to bring Judaism back to its constitutive relation to those who are not Jewish. You will remember Said's reference to the unhoused and diasporic character of Jewish life, one that he says aligns Judaism, quote, in our vast age of population transfers with refugees, exiles, expatriates, and immigrants. Of course, it's against such hordes that Levinas seeks to protect Judaism, but for Said, those populations are precisely the ones who make the continuing ethical and political demand upon Jews, and with whom the Jews, who have suffered persecution and displacement historically, have good reasons to respond however and whenever they can. This responsiveness seemed to be what Levinas meant by the ethical, but if the Fords are faceless, then no response is possible or obligatory within his terms. The response that is obligatory, however, requires that we understand Said as constituting a different political future than the one that Levinas explicitly provided. The other is not simply on the far side of the border, itself violently imposed and maintained, and there's no separation wall that can nullify the ethical demand for responsiveness to the suffering of the other. How are we to think this responsibility across a border that is meant to differentiate populations, to prevent their inmixing, and to render faceless an entire population who, on average, lives on less than $2 a day? Buber could not imagine the separation wall, though he understood that there were those who would always oppose the notion of living together. But now that living apart is mandated by violently policed borders and walls, how do we think the obligation of the other when the face, quite literally, can no longer be seen, and when the media does not show the face, and when Haaretz raises money for the poor in Israel, but not for those who are subject to starvation within the violently policed borders of Gaza? Doubtless, Buber had a point in believing that political forms of alliance could emerge from ways of life that involved living together, working together in deinstitutionalized ways, and such alliances, in his view, could provide the foundation and model for collaborative associations seeking nonviolent and just solutions to conflicts that appear intractable. And though it's crucial, I'd say, to form such communities, bilingual educational institutions, bilingual theatrical productions, cooperative resistance movements, the larger problem has to do with a certain facelessness that has become the norm within the dominant media. If belonging to the nation of Israel is a precondition of an ethical bearing, then there can be no ethical bearing toward those who are outside the walls of the nation state, at which point there is no other and there is no ethical relation. Said perhaps points in the direction of an ethical and political alliance that can only be achieved by living to the side of one's nationalism, of one's identification, allowing for a decentering of a nationalist ethos. And I would add that this can only be done in the context of a polity that does not discriminate on the basis of ethnicity or religion, and that opens up the very notion of the border to critical historical reflection and analysis, and ceases its violent practices of exclusion and harassment. So in concluding, I want to ask what it might mean to begin the practice of undoing nationalism, of countering its claims, of beginning to think and feel outside of its reach. Would this be something akin to what Cousin Edward saw about the importance of sustaining a diasporic condition for a new polity, one in which identity never fully returns to itself, where identity remains cast out in a web of relations that cannot eradicate difference or return to simple identity? It's not just a question of finding that what I am depends upon a you who is not me, but that my very capacity for attachment, and indeed for love, requires a sustained dispossession of this I. This is, I would suggest, a more radical thought than Buber's conception of the I and the thou. It would belong to a diasporic Levinas, one that we find most interestingly embodied in the work of Edward Said, and I would also say, interestingly enough, in Said's two friends, Ibrahim Abulagod and Eqbal Ahmad. Surprisingly, we have to consider what it is that one can finally love in order to move outside the claims of nationalism. So I found two quotations, quite by accident, in the course of my comparative literature teaching 2 years ago. And the two quotations, one is from Hannah Arendt and the other is from Mahmoud Darwish. And the beautiful thing about comparative literature is you get to teach them together. They seem to be in conversation with one another, and I offer them to you today as examples of a possible conversation. Arendt was, as you know, criticized by Gershom Scholem and others after she published her Eichmann in Jerusalem. Scholem called Arendt heartless for concentrating on what she takes to be the inadequate visions of Jewish politics at the time. Scholem wrote her in 1963 from Jerusalem in the following: "In the Jewish tradition, there is a concept hard to define and yet concrete enough, which we know as Ahabat Israel, love of the Jewish people. In you, dear Hannah, as in so many intellectuals who come from the German left, I find little trace of this." Since when did Hannah come from the German left? This is the first time anyone has ever said that Hannah came from the German left. Okay. Arendt replies, disputing first that she comes from the German left. She herself didn't want to really be seen that way. And indeed, she was no Marxist, for a brow I can see. And then says something quite interesting when accused of failing to love the Jewish people well enough. She writes, "You are quite right. I am not moved by love of this sort, and for two reasons. I have never in my life loved any people or collective, neither the German people, nor the French, nor the American, nor the working class, or anything of that sort. I indeed love only my friends, and the only kind of love I know of and believe in is the love of persons. Secondly, this love of the Jews," she must have been rough. Okay. Secondly, "this love of the Jews would appear to me, since I am myself Jewish, as something rather suspect. I cannot love myself or anything which I know is part and parcel of my own person. To clarify this, let me tell you of a conversation I had in Israel with a prominent political personality who was defending the, in my opinion, disastrous non-separation of religion and state in Israel. What he said, I'm not sure of the exact words anymore, ran something like this." Okay, so this is Arendt quoting some nameless public personality in Israel talking to Arendt. You will understand that, as a socialist, I, of course, do not believe in God. I believe in the Jewish people. Arendt now. I found this a shocking statement. Being too shocked, I did not reply at the time. But I could have answered, the greatness of this people was once that it believed in God and believed in him in such a way that its trust and love towards him was greater than its fear. And now this people believes only in itself? What good can come out of that? Well, in this sense, I do not love the Jews, nor do I believe in them. I merely belong to them as a matter of course, beyond dispute or argument. End of paragraph. All right, then in Darwish's Memory for Forgetfulness, his literary account of the bombings of Beirut in 1982, a book which you should read again because it is unfortunately all too timely once again, Mahmoud Darwish, perhaps the most esteemed Palestinian poet in the world, describes a scene with his Jewish lover. They've been making love and he becomes sleepy. He's aware that he has to report to the Israeli police. He's within Israeli territories in order to avoid being jailed or permanently expelled, right? And during that time, there was a demand to report once a day if you were Palestinian and not an Israeli citizen. His is the first person voice in the quotation that follows. Well, actually, that may not be true. I'll just read it. He asks the Jewish lover, "Do the police know the address of this house?" She answered, "I don't think so, but the military police do. Do you hate Jews?" I said, Darwish, "I love you now." She said, "That's not a clear answer." I said, and the question itself wasn't clear, as if I were to ask you, "Do you love Arabs?" She said, "That's not a question." I asked, "And why is your question a question?" She said, "Because we have a complex. We have more need of answers than you do." I said, "Are you crazy?" She said, "A little. But you haven't told me if you love Jews or hate them." I said, Darwish, "I don't know, and I don't want to know, but I do know I like the plays of Euripides and Shakespeare. I like fried fish, boiled potatoes, the music of Mozart, and the city of Haifa. I like grapes, intelligent conversation, autumn, Picasso's blue period, and I like wine and the ambiguity of mature poetry. As for Jews, they're not a question of love or hate." She said, "Are you crazy?" I said, "A little." She asked, "Do you like coffee?" I said, "I love coffee and the aroma of coffee." She rose naked, even of me, and I felt the pain of those from whom a limb has been severed. Citing which text? Later, he changes tone, only to change it again. She asks, "And you? What do you dream about?" And he replies, "That I stop loving you." She asks, "Do you love me?" He replies, "No, I don't love you. Did you know that your mother, Sarah, drove my mother, Hagar, into the desert?" She asks, "Am I to blame then? Is it for that you do not love me?" And he replies, "No, you're not to blame, and because of that, I don't love you," or "I love you," end quote. So that last line carries, I think, a certain paradox. I don't love you, or I love you. This is both proximity and aversion. It's unsettled. It's not of one mind. It's hardly a model for multiculturalism. It might be said to be the affect, the emotional tenor of an impossible and necessary union, the strange logic by which one wishes to go and insists upon staying. Surely, binationalism is not the same as love, but there is, we might say, a necessary and impossible attachment that makes a mockery of identity, that establishes an ambivalence as a result of the decentering of a certain nationalist ethos, and that forms the basis of a permanent ethical demand, something unresolved, the disquiet of ambivalence, the diasporic conditions of a new polity, an impossible task, and so all the more necessary. Thank you.